Already afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Executive Director Gupta and his very able staff for inviting me and for the excellent arrangements. Initially, I must say I was hesitant to come because I'm no expert of non-traditional securities or even traditional security issues. But when I was told that I'll be speaking in this session, I could not resist the temptation, and that's why I'm here. I would also like to echo the comments of our chair and Professor Varu, very appropriate observation, and congratulate IDSA at the same time for including economic and financial security issues in this topic of non-traditional security. My own institution, RSIS, has not done so yet. I think we should change. Let me begin out by spelling out my key message before presenting my paper, lest I run out of time. And the key message applies as much to international trade integration as well as to finance, as well as to connectivity issues. Yesterday, Mr. Samir Pradhan mentioned for energy security, India should look to the Gulf countries and India should use a multi-pronged approach. Very appropriate. India should look west for that. My message is that to further leverage its position in the G20 and to further enhance India's lead role in Asia and enhance its engagement with Asia, India should look towards the East and enhance its engagement with East Asia. Of course, I'm very cognizant of the fact that India has a very robust look East policy, but I see scope for greatly strengthening that. I make these points in all the publications that our chair mentioned. I think strengthening India's look East policy further would certainly be good for India in terms of greater trade and investment with East Asia, greater financial cooperation, greater connectivity, and so on and so forth. I would also like to submit that greater engagement with East Asia would be good for rest of Asia, especially South Asia, and I have advanced the hypothesis that greater integration of India with East Asia would also be good in order to drive integration within East Asia. Many of our participants mentioned, rightly so, that SAARC has not gone anywhere. And linking India with East Asia would also be good for Asia, as it would lead to, I use the word very cautiously, re-emergence of Asia. Not only in the sense of Asia's dynamism, but Asia's integration. For the first 18 years after the birth of Christ, Asia was not only dominant in terms of GDP, but Asia was also very well connected. That is now starting to happen once again. And I think India has a very important role to play. And of course, India's engagement with East Asia would also be good for the world. So I try to apply these thoughts to the topic at hand of crisis prevention and crisis resolution. And I would like to brief you about what is happening in East Asia, defined as ASEAN plus 3, which includes the ASEAN 10 plus China, Japan, and Korea. Sorry, India is not there yet. No? Okay. So I will talk about this global financial safety net. Other synonyms for that would be the international monetary system, as our colleague from China mentioned, or international financial architecture. But I use the word that was coined at the Seoul summit of the G20, namely the global financial safety net. I will begin with some definitions, talk about how that architecture was centralized in the past, how it is now starting to evolve into a more decentralized architecture, and then throw out some thoughts on how we can enhance Asia's and India's voice in that architecture. Global financial safety nets are essentially crisis prevention. We can try to prevent a crisis. We will not be successful, as world experience has shown. So if we are not successful, how do we resolve a crisis? Both definitions are very important. And according to the IMF, there are various layers, hierarchy, if you like, of a global financial safety net. At the multilateral level, of course, you have the IMF and its various facilities. And in response to financial globalization, IMF has come out with various new facilities like the FCL and PCL. And efforts have also been made at the regional level to enhance financial safety nets. Most visibly now in Europe, we have the European Economic Financial Stability Fund. Unfortunately, that fund became sort of defunct after Standards and Poor's downgraded 9 European countries. So this particular fund lost its AAA rating. But Europeans have plans to establish a fundamental European stability mechanism. I will talk about that. There are the bilateral facilities among central banks around the world. And as Ms. Wang mentioned, national financial safety nets, which is essentially accumulation of reserves. And Asian countries have successfully accumulated a lot of reserves. But accumulating reserves has an opportunity cost. As she mentioned, if the US dollar were to be depreciated, China is in deep trouble. And the opportunity cost of holding reserves are also very high. So that is a fundamental dilemma that China faces. And GFSN was a new agenda item introduced at the Seoul summit. It could not be discussed at the Cannes summit because Sarkozy was busy together with Angela Merkel, fighting the European crisis, or so they said. They haven't fought it yet. So hopefully it will be revived in the Los Cabos summit in Mexico in June this year. So the centralized architecture of the past, architecture that was established in Bretton Woods in 1944, when US, the hegemon of the day, invited 44 like-minded countries, agreed to establish the IMF and World Bank, agreed on the quota, the charter, voting rights, the chairs, and so on and so forth. Like-minded countries, right? So IMF was established, and subsequently in the 70s, G7, and later G8, I think in 78 or something, Russia joined. So we had an architecture which looks like this, very simple, very centralized. You had G7 and G8 as the overarching institutions, and you had IMF fighting crisis. So absolutely. This architecture worked fairly well until we had the Latin American debt crisis, as Professor Varu mentioned, in the 80s, the Asian financial crisis of 97 and 98, and of course the other crisis now. The IMF system of fixed but adjustable exchange rates, as you also know, collapsed in 1971 or 1973, depending on what aspect you are looking at. Since then, IMF has now taken a new role of a crisis fighter and a crisis resolver. But that system has not worked well for various reasons I will discuss. So we are now starting to see the evolution of a more decentralized global financial safety net. We still have, of course, IMF is very much there as the multilateral financial safety net. Then you have the bilateral safety nets, which are swap arrangements among central banks. And then you have the regional financial safety nets. I already mentioned Europe. Europe is to have this European stability mechanism to be established in June 2012 with a capital of 500 billion euros. That is supposed to be a permanent fund, so it will be the European Monetary Fund. European Monetary Fund is very much coming up. In Asia, as Professor Varu mentioned, we have the CMIM, which is a $120 billion crisis fund that has been established by the ASEAN plus 3 countries. And, despite the fact that the region had AMRO, when countries in the region like Korea, Singapore, and Indonesia faced withdrawal of capital, when US faced the liquidity crunch in the crisis of 2008-2009, they did not go to the Chiang Mai initiative. Instead, they triggered their swap arrangements with the US Fed. US Fed came to the rescue. So the bilateral safety net was very important. Why was the Chiang Mai initiative not used to meet the liquidity crunch faced by Korea, Singapore and Indonesia at that time? Because there was no institution to implement the Chiang Mai initiative. There was no country, no institution to do the due diligence. And unless due diligence is done, countries will not lend to each other because you could have moral hazard. That problem is now also being addressed, and a new institution called the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, which is an ASEAN Plus 3 institution, has been established in Singapore. So that institution is also very much in place. The research office is really a misnomer. Actually, it is a regional surveillance unit. They don't want to use that because IMF will not be very happy for obvious reasons, right? And there are plans eventually in East Asia to merge the CMIM with AMRO. And what will that lead to? It will lead to the Asian Monetary Fund. The Asian Monetary Fund, which was shut down at the time of the Asian financial crisis, is very much alive and kicking in East Asia. Then we have the regional financial safety nets in the Gulf. We have the Arab Monetary Fund. In North America, there is the North American Financing Arrangement, which is a parallel type of thing to NAFTA. Latin America, you have the Latin American Reserve Fund, and at the lowest level, you have the reserve accumulation by countries. So think of this, if you like, those of you in public finance, fiscal federalism. You have the central government, you have the state and provincial government, and you have the local government, right? All working in a complementary manner. So that is the architecture that is now starting to evolve in East Asia. Let's see, I have discussed this very quickly. We have this CMIM, $120 billion fund. That is now being in the process of being doubled, $240 billion. It may happen as early as May 2012, when the ASEAN Plus 3 finance ministers meet in Manila, ADB, in the sidelines of the ADB annual meeting, and the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office I already mentioned. AMRO, of course, is a new institution. The baby has been born. It's starting to crawl. It still has to stand up and walk. It has to be an adult. But still, it has made some good progress, some data over there. Now, the next part of my presentation, what are the factors driving the process of decentralized global financial safety net? Number one factor is, of course, financial globalization. Financial globalization is very different from trade globalization. And financial globalization really started after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. During the Bretton Woods period, I don't know how many of you know, IMF allowed capital controls. It was after the collapse of Bretton Woods period and the emergence of the Washington Consensus, U.S. Treasury view and all that, that IMF preached deregulation of capital account. And there were various other factors. Financial globalization increased. Jeffrey Sachs, Stiglitz wrote about the dangers of unfettered finance, how it could lead to crisis, sudden surge of short-term capital and withdrawal of such capital. Financial globalization led to a new family of crisis, very different from the crisis we had witnessed in Latin America, no longer a debt crisis, but a very severe systemic banking crisis, bursting of asset bubbles, stock markets, housing markets, as happened in Asia, in East Asia in 1997, 1998, as happened in the US when the subprime mortgage crisis occurred. So you have a new type of crisis called capital account crisis. How do you manage such crisis? We discussed about that. Our Rear Admiral mentioned that global challenges require global actions. But of course, those global actions have to be implemented by national parliaments. So we need national parliaments as well. And we need regional actions. So we need a multi-pronged approach to address financial globalization. That is why we have this multi-layered financial architecture evolving. The legitimacy of the old architecture led by the U.S. is also very much questioned. U.S. is no longer the hegemon, right? Power is shifting to various emerging markets. We are witnessing the emergence of a multipolar world. That I don't need to belabor the point. Everybody is aware of that. And the inflexibility of the old architecture. Now, we have applied the theory of clubs to explain the governance of the IMF. Ms. Huang alluded to the governance of the IMF. IMF was established as a club, and all distinguished members of the club protect their right, their charter, their quota, their voting powers, their chairs. They protect this with all their might. No, there is resistance. Managing Director DSK, irrespective of what happened, was a friend of Asia towards the end. He wanted to give greater voting powers to Asia. But can he do so? No, he cannot, because every major decision in relation to the governance of IMF has to be approved by a super majority, which means that 85% of the member parliaments have to approve. So as Ms. Huang mentioned, even the agreement to change the quotas a bit, that was initiated in 2006 when the IMF and World Bank met in Singapore. Annual meeting was held in Singapore. Even that agreement has not been implemented. How about the 5% reallocation reached in Pittsburgh, when the Pittsburgh Summit said, oh, we'll reallocate 5% more. And in Seoul, they said, okay, 6% more to emerging markets. We'll make China number 2 in the IMF. When will that be implemented? I think reforms of the IMF governance can at best proceed at a glacial pace. And you know how slow glaciers move, right? We talked about that when we talked about climate change. Okay? So what do? We cannot sit around. So we need to have regional solutions to help them. That is another argument. IMF made important policy mistakes. IMF was not equipped to handle financial globalization. As I said, it allowed capital controls and it could not handle the new prescription. When it came to Asia and said, tighten your monetary policy, fiscal policy, devalue your currency, all those measures were wrong. IMF still very much hated in this. So IMF was not a good doctor. It did not diagnose the problem properly. Okay. Now, in order to assess goals, what the next steps should be in terms of monetary integration in East Asia, my university was commissioned by the ASEAN to do a perception survey of East Asian opinion leaders, defined as government policy makers, academics, private sectors, and the media. We asked various questions. What do you think of AMRO? What do you think of CMI? Does the region need AMF? And if we have the AMF, should the AMF compete with the IMF or complement the IMF? And the responses were overwhelming. Everybody felt that CMIM and AMRO were important initiatives. They all felt that in the medium term, CMIM and AMRO should be combined and the AMF should be established. So my last part, my recommendation, how can we enhance Asia's and India's voice in this architecture? Now, Asian countries, I believe, should get together. I believe that India should be invited and needs to participate in CMIM and AMRO in some way. If not a full member, maybe as a dialogue partner or an associate member and so on. So it is very important for India to participate and Asia to speak with one voice at the G20. That is number one. So Asia should also coordinate its view with other developing countries. There is an important initiative which was initiated by Singapore. Singapore, as you know, punches above its weight in international affairs. There is a 3G group, Global Governance Group, which is under the auspices of the UN. Several middle-income countries who are not members of the G20 are members of that group. They meet every time before the G20 meeting, and their messages are carried to the G20 by Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General. And after the G20 summit, Ban Ki-moon briefs these guys on what happened. So increased membership If more South Asian countries could be members of this group, it would help. So Asia's voice, India's voice has to be heard, both in Asia and in the global governance regime. So I will stop.